It will have sound. It will have sound. Yeah. Right. So first things first. Let's get rid of this this bloke here. I don't really need him. Let's look at how to create other primitives. Now, I mean, I know some of you have already done this, but it defaults to the poly modeling shelf, right? Each one of these is called a shelf. And there are different things, and they're split up into different categories for doing different things. Most of the time you're going to be spent in the poly modeling shelf, maybe the rendering shelf, and maybe the Arnold shelf. I don't think you're going to be looking at much else apart from those three shelves, because that's all you really need to do. You need to know how to create an object, how to make some lights, and that's about kind of it almost when it comes to the shelf kind of stuff. But poly modeling, we've started off with a cube, and obviously you can start off with any one of these primitives as well. You can even do text as well, so you can type in some text and it'll make 3D object out of your text. SVG can take a vectorized Illustrator type file, like a graphic-y kind of logo, say that you made in Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator, and it can turn that into a model. So super good for doing logos and things like that. But you just click any one of these and you'll get a primitive. Now, if you're working at the scale I'm at the moment, you'll probably have to increase the size of them, but I'll remind you actually of something you can do to change that. So you can create a cylinder, you create what they call a torus, or obviously is a donut, and you can change some of the options in these. Oh, there's an email coming through. If you want to change the options of these, you can do it in several different ways. You can do it after the fact, so you can create the object, and then you can either, if you're in the channel box section, you can click this little input here, polytorus, torus, and down the bottom here you've got things like the radius of it. Then you've got the section radius, so obviously a torus or a donut has the overall radius, but it also has the radius around its sort of the thick part. So just think of this as section radius, might as well just think of this as thickness. You can change things like the twist as well, which are a little bit weird. Not much use for you at the moment, but if you want to do very, very specific modeling and editing and you want the polygons to be aligned in a certain direction, the twist can come in handy. And then you've got, really, really importantly, you have the subdivisions axis and the subdivisions height, and they're both set to 20. That it's essentially how inherently smooth it's going to make this starting object. So at 20 and 20, it's a bit smooth from a distance. If I turn this off, but when you get anywhere close to it, you can see that it's got these little faceted sides, this profile, and that's because at the moment we haven't got enough subdivisions to make it look smooth. If I doubled this to 40, you can see more lines being added. If I put 40 in here, and as I do that, it becomes smoother and smoother. So if I go really high, let's double this for both, 80 and 80. See, there's now loads and loads and loads of polygons in this, but it also now looks very, very smooth. That is one way of making objects smoother. It's not the preferred way. Normally, you're going to want to keep the subdivision axes for whatever object you're making as low as you can possibly get away with. Let's do 8 and 4. You know, that might not look very smooth, but there's not many polygons in there to mess around with, and you know, that could be a good start for any number of kind of UFO kind of bases, that kind of thing. But in general, when you're modeling, the goal is to describe the shape of an object using the least amount of actual polygons. That's the sort of the tricksy, puzzly kind of part of it. The good news is that you can model super, super low polygon, and then when you're happy, you can hit a magic button to make it smooth, like I've just done there. And that's, I'm toggling the number 1 and 3. So any object you've got selected, if you hit 3, it will smooth it and give you a smooth version of it. So you don't actually have to model super high res to get a smooth result. So that's another thing, another very important concept to get into your minds. So that's, and you can change all of this. So if I go into here, I had to go into the channel box and put polytorus. Just to make life, well, I suppose Maya would say, oh, we want to give you loads of options, but other people might say, no, you're just making it too confusing. You can change all of this stuff in the channel box, and it looks like this. It looks very numerical, a little bit scary, a little bit blending in with all these other inexplicable sort of numbers and values and settings. But you can also change these settings in the attribute editor, which is this little tab just here. And if you click that, this gives you a different kind of layout of your object. And again, a lot of it is meaningless and not important for you at the moment at all. But amongst these tabs here, you've got ptorus, ptorus shape. The one you want to look at is this one called polytorus. So this has all of those values that were in the channel box down here, but it has them in a maybe slightly more user-friendly sort of way. It's got actually got little sliders that you can go like this to play around. And that twist thing, and you can interactively change the subdivisions. You can do all that in here by selecting the parameter you want, so it goes blue, and then if you move into the viewport and hold down the middle mouse button and go left and right, it does the same thing. But just so you know that you could change the settings of your object that you've created, or your primitive, let's call these primitives, these are primitive objects. You can change all their settings after you've created them. Now what you definitely don't want to be doing though is creating an object, beginning to literally model more bits onto it, doing the stuff I'm going to show you in a moment, and then go back and change these settings. Your object then will really kind of go crazy and go all over the place. So you want to be fairly sure that this stuff is at the right setting, the right base setting, before you start modeling. Now you can set all this stuff beforehand, because you can create primitives in a different way. You can create primitives by going create polygon primitives, and you've got even more options here. You've got options that don't show up in the shelf. So you've got pipes and you've got helixes. Let's do a helix. That's quite cool. Again, you can't see the helix because I'm modeling to scale and it defaults to being really small, but if I just scale it up, you get that, like a coiled shape just there. Now you can also, instead of scaling that up and then changing the settings, you can go to create polygon primitives, helix, and go to the options. This will now let you set all those values before you even create the object. So coils, I think that's how many times it goes around itself, the height, you know, let's just change all these to slightly random settings, and then you click create. If I scale it up, yeah, you've got more coils. Now I think until you start getting really, really confident in Maya and you know exactly what you want to model, it's probably best to just create the object and then worry about adjusting it afterwards, because Maya isn't the best. It doesn't show you, when you're creating that object, it doesn't show you an interactive version of it. There are other vague interaction modes, but I want to keep those, you know, we're not going to look at those because it's just more confusing stuff. What I think is important is just to know that you can create an object by going create polygon primitives, and you can change their initial settings in here by going to the little cubes. Or you can create the object and then afterwards change your mind and go, no, you know, I only want that amount of cubes, and I definitely don't want, you know, I definitely want this sort of skinnier just there. Create a kind of pipey kind of shape like that. I can just mess around with it. So that's primitives, and that's how to change the parameters on primitives. Having said that, I reckon the only primitives you really ever kind of need are cubes, cylinders, spheres, and grids, to be honest. And you know what? I'll know when you're really getting to sort of elite level, god tier status, is when you make everything using just a plane, a simple plane to begin with, which you can completely do. You can start off with a plane that is as simple as that, or one by one plane with no sort of subdivisions, and you can create pretty much anything starting from this base point. But I think to begin with, know that it's totally fine to start out with spheres, cubes, cylinders and planes. Maybe in very special cases where you really do need a donut shape, you could use a torus to start with, and I can sort of see why you would occasionally want a cone, but you can get the same thing starting with a cylinder. And I think that's another thing to bear in mind. It's just always, it's like painting. It's like looking at an object and thinking, what is the most basic shape that makes up that object? And that's the object I'll start with. So that's the, again, get that into your mindset. Okay, let's look at actual modeling then. And I'll start off actually with a cube this time. I'll make the cube nice and big. So when we've changed pivot points before, we've held down right mouse button, and you can change and you can select the different what's called components of the object. By default we're in object mode, so it just moves the whole thing, but it's got these other options. Now forget about vertex face, forget about multi and UV for now. By the way, that happens if you see a little arrow, it'll take you to a submenu, and if you get lost you can just go back to the last point. Let's go to face. So you can see here that this cube is actually made up of 6 square faces connected together. Now these are faces, but they're also, the technical name for them is polygon. And polygons are made up of edges, and edges are connected together using vertices. So if I go to edge, it will now allow me to select only the edges. And if I select vertex, it allows me to select only the vertices. And you can move these just as you could move any other part of the object. So you can select one vertex, hit W, exactly the same shortcut key, and now you can move that vertex around to warp the shape of your initial cube, make it non-cube. If I go to face, it's more useful in face mode, because with face mode I can quickly and accurately, instead of scaling this cube up, I could just move this face up to make it bigger. But because I can also scale this face, hit R, I can now make a shape like that, like an obelisk kind of shape. So this is actual modeling. This is selecting the subcomponents of an object, moving them, rotating them, and scaling them. This is how you begin to form more complicated objects. You'll be doing a lot of extruding of faces, and this is probably the most common modeling task you'll be doing. What this means is it takes one face or one vertex or one edge, because you can extrude all three of those things, and it copies the component, it copies the face, edge or vertex, but at the same time also connects it with the ones it's already attached to. I find a lot of these things, when you're trying to put into words what's happening, it's so abstract it can be tricky to figure out, you know, what on earth I mean by that. So it's better to show you. So there are a couple of ways to extrude a component. There's the pressing the actual button that does the extrude thing, and then there's the shortcut kind of way. And I'll show you the shortcut way first, because I always love shortcuts, and I think this will be quicker for you. So you select one or more face, edge or vertex. You go to either W for move, E for rotate, or R for scale. Let's keep it a W for the moment. Now if I just move that, I'm just moving the face on its own. But if I hold down Shift and hover over one of these manipulators, it says extrude. So now when I move this face, it's going to pull a new face out of the old one. So just to show you again, if I just move this on its own, it just extends that face outwards. But if I hold Shift, it pulls a new face out of this, leaving the edges of the original one there. So then if I went like that and held Shift and pulled this out, you can start to see how you could block out stuff super quick using this method as well. Holding down Shift and then selecting another face, holding down Shift, you could easily and quickly build up a series of walls doing it this way. You don't have to just translate, you can scale as well. So if I hold down Shift when I'm in scale mode as opposed to translate mode, what's going to happen is it's going to, well, I'll show you. It's going to shrink a new face into the original one and attach it. Now let go of shift now. Now I can resize this to maybe make it more even. Now I can go back to move, hold down shift and pull this one out. And you get that kind of look. It's best just to create a cube initially when you're getting to grips with this extrude command and just start pulling faces out from all the different sides, while sometimes holding shift and sometimes not holding shift. So that's extrude using the shift method. But you've also got, and that works with rotate and scale as well. It just behaves in slightly different ways. Sorry, just having a drink of my coffee. But we've also got this other way of extruding, and this is going to take us into this middle little tab here. So we've looked at briefly the channel box, especially in terms of, if I go back to object mode, especially in terms of how you can see where you're moving your objects to and what you're rotating and how much they're scaled by. We've also briefly looked at the attribute editor, where you can change the, if I go around here all the way to the end, this is going to bring us to another important point in a moment, where we can also change the settings. But if I start changing these now, this object's going to blow up. Whoa, see? Because all those extrusions I did on those faces have got secret little numbers assigned to them that you can't see by default. And if I change the subdivision's width, then it's going to add new faces in, which is going to screw up the numbering of all the faces I've already moved. So that's why you don't want to be changing this number after you've done a bunch of extrusions. Anyway, let's get back to this middle tab here. This is the modeling toolkit, and this is a place where you'll probably be spending a reasonable amount of your modeling time with this sort of box open. You can extrude faces here as well. This toolkit here is for doing all your modeling on polygonal objects. So at the top, you know how we right click and we can choose whether we want vertex, edge or face? Well, we can also in the modeling toolkit decide whether we want to use vertex, edges, faces, object mode. This is UVs, but we'll get into that when we start doing texturing. And you can also have multi-component mode. Click this on and I can select, you notice how I can select faces, edges and points all at the same time. This is just preference. Sometimes you'll just feel freer if you've always got the option quickly of choosing all the different component types. Sometimes you don't want to accidentally, say you're trying to really pick out a finicky small little detail, you keep on accidentally hitting the edges and you just want the vertices, that's when you might want to just go back to vertex mode. And at any point you can click to go back to object mode. So that can be quite handy. It also is useful because it shows you how many things you've got selected underneath it. So if I go to faces and select a whole bunch, it says 12 faces selected. That can help as well when it looks like visually it looks like you've got nothing selected and yet it still says you've got one face selected here. Then you know that you've messed up somewhere along the lines and you've got some kind of tiny hidden polygon face that's going to give you grief. So that's how you can select the different component parts of an object up here. Let's go back to faces then. Select a face and we can extrude it. Instead of holding shift, we can select a face and hit this extrude button instead. This gives you a little pop-up menu that just sort of floats and hovers just here, and it changes the icon on the face. So you do a bunch of things all in one go here. You can either adjust it using these this slider just here. So if you click this, it's on yellow at the moment, left click and move back and forth, and it extrudes out. You can do local translate in Z, which is going to look like exactly the same thing when you're just extruding one face away from another face. That changes slightly differently when you're dealing with multiple faces that are pointing in odd directions. You can offset it. You can automatically also give it a little bit of scaling as you pull it out. And probably most importantly, and what gives it maybe the edge over the shift method in one way, is that you can extrude something and then decide how many divisions do you want to happen. So at the moment only one division, but if I up that, you can see how it's adding in even subdivisions, and that can be super useful as well. Let's bring that back down to 1. So you can extrude that way, and then when you're happy with it, just click away from the object and you're back to working like this. So there's two ways of extrusion. Select something and shift move it, or select something and hit the extrude button and do it that way instead. You can see how you can use these manipulators to do it. If for whatever reason, you might sometimes find that this number here moves too slow or too fast. To change that, you see this little pie wedge up here. If you right mouse button on that, it essentially sets the speed of these sliders, so you can change it to fast, medium, slow, slowest. So if you set it to slowest, that means you've got a lot of fine-tuned control over it. But sometimes, obviously, you don't want to be doing that over and over and over and over again, so you want to set that pie slice to something like medium instead, and it will go a bit quicker. So that's how you extrude using shift or this button, and you'll be doing extrusion is probably, as I said, the most commonly done modeling task. Let's also now look at maybe the other most important tool out of all of this is this one called multi-cut. Now multi-cut can do lots and lots of different things. It's a multi-cut, it's like a Swiss Army knife modeling tool. So if you just click it to activate it, it highlights blue and it automatically multi-component selects, because you can multi-cut across edges, faces and vertices, and it turns your icon into this little scalpel knife, and as you hover over your object this happens, and this can be a bit scary when you've activated it, because you think the second you click on something it's done something, it's made a cut, it's inserted a vertex. What's happening is it's just kind of snapping, helpfully to be honest, to edges, vertices and faces, and you can see the lines that you can draw out. So it is most basic, but also maybe it's least used. You can use multi-cut to say, okay, I want to start there, and I want to add a line that goes into a specific kind of shape across this polygon, because I want to then extrude it in a certain way. So you can, better again to show you, if I click that with vertex and then I click into the face and then I click to this edge here, I've created a new set of edges going across the surface, and if I hit multi-cut, I've now committed myself to having this edge just here. Now this is, I'm actually showing something I don't want you to do, because this causes a bunch of problems later down the line when you've got polygons existing in objects that have this kind of layout. Ideally, the goal is not only to make your objects have the least amount of faces and vertices to accurately describe their condition. The goal is one step further, is to try and make, if at all possible, every single one of these faces have 4 sides, or be what we call a quad. And that will become important as we progress later on. So this is not so good, because this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sides. But what this does allow us to do, just as an example, is it now allows me to select that polygon and I can extrude this. So now I can extrude this odd shape out from the object because I cut it to begin with. But anyway, I'm going to undo that and show you how multi-cut is going to be more usually used. And it's going to be used to add what we call edge loops. When I did the extrusion using the button way, let's just do it again just to show you, and we've got this divisions just here, and I can change this to decide how many divisions I want. There is also, this is very useful to be able to manually decide this, to not let Maya kind of do it automatically. It's for you to deliberately place these edge loops. So if I just put that down to nothing again, this is what multi-cut can be used for. If you click into multi-cut, by default it behaves like this, but the second you hold down the control key, the left control key, I don't know if it works for the right one, well, it does work for the right one, but I just use it for the left one because I'm right-handed, so I'm holding the mouse with my right and the left hand can go to the left control key. So if I hold down control, Now I can add in edge loops. And if I hover it along one set of edges, it will show you how it adds them along that section, how it adds like a cross section. If I do it this way, it shows you how I'm going to add it that way. You can see how that works. This is super, super important for getting tight, crisp edges and just deciding yourself exactly where the division. Say this was a bunch of walls, right? And I want a doorway to appear here. I'd need an extra line going across here to define the top of the doorway. So an edge loop might be one way of going around adding that. So I can go, okay, I want it to be about there. And when I'm happy, I just click the left mouse button and it adds in that edge loop. And it goes all the way around the object. And when you want to get out of multi-cut tool, just click the button again and you're out of it. And you want to go back into object mode. So that's adding an edge loop, right? So multi-cut's active, hold down control. Like I mentioned last week though, with the snapping, you kind of want to try and be as precise and as neat as you can possibly be. So the way you can do that with this multi-cut tool is you can hold down control, but then also hold down shift at the same time. And now it's going to snap that multi-cut line, that edge loop, into percentage increments between these two edges here. So I can do it at any one of these edges, and you can see here it sets the snap to 10% by default. So if I change that to 30%, you see there's hardly any increments. It just snaps to 30%. Let's put it back down to 10. If you just want to automatically straight up get the middle between there and there, before holding down control, just hold down shift, and as you move your mouse around, you'll see it just locks to the center. Now if I hold down control, I can add it. I can see exactly where the halfway point is. I can add it like that. Again, just try and be as neat as possible. So that's adding edge loops. Oh, and another email. When you add edge loops, again, just to reiterate the same basic point over and over again, to be boring and also just so there's no excuse, you all know it, think before adding an edge loop. Because you notice when you add an edge loop, you don't just add it to the bit that you want, you add it all the way around an object. As long as Maya can trace an uninterrupted line around an object, it's going to add that edge loop in there. So think carefully. You need less than you think you need. I've seen, I think week 1, I saw some people modelling some more detail than was necessary into their IKEA Billy shelves. They were adding in way too many subdivisions. You only want these, you've got to treat these as like super special, precious little things that you think very carefully before adding. Edge loops, as we progress through the semester, are very, very useful for having smooth shapes, but also being able to control where an object is smooth and where it is sharp. And edge loops are good for that because they help you sort of tighten up and define sharpness in an area. But they're also just generally very useful all the way around, all the way through your modelling. Just as I mentioned, just be very, very careful about how you add stuff. Right. Having said that, let's actually model something from reference. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a fork. A picture of a fork. Let's bring up that one. Right, unfortunately I don't have, well I do have 2 monitors, but you won't be able to see it. So I'm just going to keep on switching backwards and forwards, and I'll show you how I would begin to model out something like this fork. So you look at the fork and you think, what's the most basic beginning shape that fork can grow out of? In fact, does anyone have any opinions on what that might be? You. A cube, correct. Yeah. As I mentioned, once you reach New Game Plus Plus of Maya modeling, you'll start modeling everything with grids, and you'll look at people using cubes as like newbies and stuff like that. But for now, there's no shame in using a cube. So you start off with a cube. Let's start off with a cube, just a default one. I am going to make it bigger. I'm going to make my cube's going to be, my fork's obviously going to be giant size. This is the case where you probably want to shrink your scale grid back down to more like its default state. So I'm going to start off with a cube. I'm going to start off with the handle, this bit first. I'm going to work my way towards, I think they call these the tines. That's what those little bits on forks are called. But I'm going to start off here and just work my way up to the end. So first of all, I'm going to squish it down. And I'm going to squish it down that kind of way. And I'm going to constantly go back and look at this and go, and I'm not going to trust what I think is going on. I'm going to trust what's actually going on and not use guesswork, because again, that's the best way of doing this kind of thing. So I'm going to, okay, does that feel, if I chopped it off there and I looked at just this bit, do the proportions feel right for that? Maybe it's a little bit longer, but not by much. Yeah? Okay, so now I'm going to think about extruding it out and getting thinner towards the end, just here. So I'm going to hold down my right mouse button and go to Face, select this face, hit W to go to Move, so I can move it like this to resize it, but instead I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to pull out a new polygonal face. So I've got a division here and here, and this is the new end of it. I'm going to look at this and go, right, this smooths out. Now, how long does it take to smooth out? I'm literally using my fingers here on this. So I'm going to say, I reckon it's not quite the whole length of this again, but it's close to it, because it's quite a gradual sort of tapering out when you look at it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this in so it gets thin. I'm going to move it further out and go back to my reference. And again, I'm going to measure, we're using just my fingers because I've only got a photo to work from, how long I think that whole handle actually is. So there. So I reckon it's this whole shape again. Yeah, it's probably about double the length. If you chopped it in half here, it's probably about, yeah. So it's probably going to be there and again. So I'm going to move it forwards a little bit more. And this is where I'm going to add an edge loop in, because at the moment it doesn't taper in quick enough. So adding an edge loop is going to help me get that tapering effect quicker. So I can go to multi-cut. Let's go back to my reference and think, okay, that tapers in relatively quickly. So I'm going to need an edge maybe about here. I can always shift this edge. So I'm holding down Control with multi-cut to decide where that edge loop is going to go. And when I'm happy, I'm going to just click once. And I'm going to go out of multi-cut. Because, again, the beginner's mistake is staying in this for too long and making too many edge loops all in one go. Make that edge loop, then stop, and then fine-tune it. So I've gone into vertex mode this time, selected all 4 of those vertices. You know they're selected because they're yellow. And I'm going to scale these in. So that taper is beginning to take shape now. But I reckon that taper probably is smoother. It probably goes a bit more like that. So I'm always going to take a step back and have a look. Maybe it goes. Maybe I need another one to go in, pull it in even quicker still, so to speak. So I'm going to go to just here. Select these vertices, kind of pull these in a bit, like that. I'm actually going to turn grid off because it's a bit easier to see my object now. Okay, so I'm going to pull it in. It's going to get really, really sort of skinny towards the end here, but then it flares out to form the main part of the fork. So I'm going to do that bit now. So I'm going to go back into face mode, select that face, and again I'm going to do that shift extrude method. So I'm going to hold down shift and then pull this out like that. And then I'm going to instantly scale it out. give us that fork kind of shape coming up here. So that scales out really, really quick and really quite short. There's not much distance between that thin part and where it flares out. And I'm going to extrude it again like this. At the moment it looks like a spatula, but also I feel like at the moment this might be a bit too wide. So again, I'm going to go to vertices and select all of them, and maybe just bring that in just a tad, just a little bit. Now it's important now to figure out how long this bit is before the actual fork bits happen, and it's not that long. It's not that, it doesn't extrude that much. I think I've done this way too much. So I'm going to pull this in just a bit like that and go back to here. Yeah, that feels a bit more like it. And I'm not going to bother at the moment. At the moment it's completely flat. Obviously a fork also curves up and then down and then back up again. We can add all that bit in right at the end. So now it's to create the actual tines of the fork. Again, this is where I'm going to add in some edge loops. So I'm going to go to multi-cut, and to begin with I'm going to add an edge loop dead center, then dead center again, and then dead center here as well. So I've created 4 polygons that what we call the tines can sort of stretch out from. So let's have a look at that. Let's select. Actually, no. Let's add in more. Let's add in more lines. Actually, we'll do this a bit of a kind of brute force way to begin with, just to get the message across. So go back into multi-cut. So I'm going to add in a line there, and a line there, line there, 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 and there. So if I select face mode now, I can select this one, this one, this one, and this one. Just holding down Shift and clicking to select a new face. And I'm going to pull these out using extrude. Obviously they're really, really thick at the moment, but we can change that easily enough. Let's also, let me think here. This is also, yeah, it's like a constant puzzle modeling. I'm going to pull in these points here. It's going to be a bit tricky to select. Whoops. Let's select that one and that one. And then let's scale these in. One other thing you can do is when you've got some sub-component parts selected, so I've got faces selected, you should be able to hold Shift and then tap, I'm going to call them the left and right chevron key. They're kind of like the little pointy arrow next to the question mark and backslash or forward slash. And what that does is it grows and shrinks a selection. It allows you to select one point and then kind of expand your selection out from that point. But I'm just going to select them one at a time to begin with. And then I'm going to shrink these in like this, make this much more like a real fork. And actually, I'm going to grow that and shrink the whole thing in a little bit. One other thing I've noticed about forks, looking at them, is you've got to get that kind of angle. You see the outside ones kind of curve inwards a little bit, and the middle side tines are completely straight. So if I select these points and move them in like this, and these points and move them in like that, I'll get that sort of realistic kind of curve in. And it's kind of attention to detail like this that's going to help out your models a lot and make them feel a lot more realistic. So that's what the fork looks like at the moment. Let's add some of that sort of curvature in. So forks, obviously, it's flat and it essentially kind of bows upwards to its maximum height, which is just at that point here. But notice we haven't got a subdivision in there yet, so we can use multi-cut to add one in, like that. Now I'm going to switch to vertex, select all those, sort of move this up, and then I'm going to move this up, maybe move it aside a little bit, and then I'm going to gradually move these, move these up as well. Till you got your basic kind of fork shape. Actually, I'm going to move these down a little bit. Might even rotate them a tad. So there you go. We've modelled a fork based on reference. It's not very smooth at the moment because we're going to get onto that later. One of the things you could do to hit smooth is you can set your object and you can hit that 3. Now it's not going to look particularly nice at the moment. Well, it's not too bad, but now you see how it's smoothed everything out. We're going to get into modelling specifically with smoothing in mind later, because again there are some very important things to bear in mind when you're modelling, and you know that you're going to hit 3 at the end of the whole process to make everything a bit smoother. Anyway, but that's like modelling a fork using just the multi-cut and then extrusion. Right, what do I want you to do? I want you to do 3 things first, and then if you have time afterwards, get on to the 4th thing. I want you to model a knife, a fork, and a spoon, right? Super simple. And I want you to do it only using the techniques that I've just shown you. And I want you to model them from reference. So make sure you Google for an image of these things and try and model it as accurately as you possibly can so the proportions are all correct. And if you can, try and do it with the minimum amount of geometry added into it. Once you've done that, and I'll be coming round in a moment to see how you're getting on with that, once you've done that, and only after you've done that, I'd like you to work on your Mars base with the blocking out section of it. Just a reminder on the Mars base in general, and I've said this to a few people on the forum, try and find one key piece of reference that you want to work to. Bear in mind that this Mars base project is not an exercise in originality, so it does not have to be the most stonkingly original design ever. I'm almost completely okay with you finding an existing design and just trying to replicate it, because this is introduction to CGI. This is about learning how to model, so I don't want you to get stressed out with also thinking you have to do the most coolest original design ever. But the important thing, I think, is you find one design that you really like, and you don't confuse yourself with just an enormous amount of reference. Also, just don't spend too much time on that reference and all that Harvard referencing for the imagery that you're finding. I really don't care about how Harvard referencey all your references for this kind of project. Let that all be for the some other lecturers like you doing that. I don't mind that. You get ample opportunity to be as academic as you like in the 3rd year when you do your final year research project, and that all has to be 3rd person Harvard reference and all that kind of stuff. For intro to CGI, don't bother with that. Okay, so yeah, knife, fork, spoon, and then start blocking out your Mars base after that. Okay, thanks everyone.